Okay, welcome everyone to Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library. A quick note before we start, this session is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube with a link to it on our website, ICSSmarks.org, within the next few days. In fact, we'd like to wish everyone a good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, because we now have program attendees from throughout the United States and around the world. My name is Alan Miller, and I will be hosting this meeting. I'm a member of the program committee that organizes the Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library. And I would like to start off by saying that we always welcome input, feedback, suggestions for topics and speakers. You can contact us through our website at ICSSmarks.org. For over a decade and a half, Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library has been a platform for presentations on a variety of topics, such as political economy, capitalism, socialism, communism, supporting the struggles of the working class, the fight against imperialism, militarism and war, the environmental movement, and the fight for racial and gender justice. In pre-pandemic times, our weekly program was hosted in person at the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library, located in Oakland, California, USA. During the pandemic, we have met every Sunday on Zoom. This program is a comradely forum for political discourse and debate. The opinions expressed are those of the participants, and they do not necessarily represent those of the ICSS or the Marxist Library. However, we are united in our respect for the work of Karl Marx, and we believe that his work remains relevant today. Our motto is taken from Karl Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach. Quote, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in many ways. The point, however, is to change it." After today's presentation, which should last about an hour, we'll have a short break, followed by question and answers from the audience. So you'll get a chance to raise whatever points you have, whatever questions you have after the presentation. Our speaker today is Stephen Gowans, an independent political analyst. His writings, which appear on his blog, What's Left. Let me go ahead and share the screen and show you guys that. What's Left, which is Gowans.blog, has a very good article on there, by the way. The pandemic is done, except for the burials, topic for today's talk. Stephen is a journalist and an author. His works have been widely reproduced online and print media in many languages and have been cited in academic journals and other scholarly works. He's the author of 3 previous books: Washington's Long War on Syria, Patriots, Traitors and Empires, a story of Korea's struggle for freedom, and Israel, a beachhead in the Middle East. Stephen made a terrific presentation last year on his last book, and today he will be speaking on his new book, which is The Killer's Henchmen, Capitalism and the COVID-19 Disaster, which is available on Baraka Books, which is barakabooks.com, a Montreal-based publishing house. With that, I'd like to welcome Stephen and welcome back. We're really happy to have you this morning. Just to note everybody that Ottawa, where Stephen is based, was in the headlines on in the news here in the US for the last couple of days. So I'm sure Stephen will comment on that, but he's going to be speaking about the topic of his new book. So Stephen, go ahead and take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. So I'm just going to jump right in. I mean, I'm going to talk about my book, or the themes of my book, and I'll talk about an hour. And let me just start with this. Pandemics are not inevitable. To be sure, the emergence of new infectious disease is a near certainty, but pandemics aren't. And in fact, that pandemics are optional and not inevitable is provable by reference to one country, China. And by following a zero COVID strategy of eliminating local transmission of the novel coronavirus, the People's Republic of China has avoided overwhelmed hospitals, has limited fatalities to extraordinarily low levels, and has escaped significant economic hardship. In short, it has kept the pandemic from its country. Now, public discourse outside of China and a few other countries that pursued a zero COVID approach accepted the pandemic as an inevitability. The inevitability narrative was highly influenced by people such as Bill Gates and others, who advanced the view that pandemics are unavoidable. And that because they're unavoidable, we need to develop vaccines and drug therapies, in anticipation of the pandemics, future pandemics, ineluctable arrival. Gates is behind the Center for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation, or CEPI. This is a nonprofit organization that's played a leading role in the fight against COVID-19 among countries in the US orbit. And the name summarizes Gates' thinking. So we need to be prepared for epidemics because they are inevitable. And the way to prepare for them is through innovation, specifically innovation in vaccines. Now, needless to say, the reality that the emergence of a novel pathogen is not a sufficient condition for a pandemic, and the fact that China demonstrated that a pandemic could be avoided by using not vaccines, but old school public health measures, refutes Gates' view. Now, Gates is a major funder of the World Health Organization, by the way, which he sees as peripheral to the fight against COVID. And CEPI, Center for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, as the center. But despite his influence on the World Health Organization, the organization's director general does not share Gates' idea that vaccines ought to be the principal tool used to fight pandemics. Here's Gates' view, just to be clear on what his view is. Quote, "The ultimate solution, the only thing that lets us get back or go back completely to normal and feel good is to create a vaccine. That's the only way." The view of World Health Organization Secretary General Tedros is, quote, "Vaccines are not the only tool. Indeed, there is no single tool that will defeat the pandemic. You can only defeat it with a comprehensive approach of vaccines in combination with proven public health and social measures that we know work." And one of the reasons we know they work is because China has demonstrated that the measures are effective. Now, China has every pandemic risk factor. But despite that, it's been one of the few countries that has escaped the COVID-19 catastrophe. In terms of the pandemic risk factors, what does it have? Well, the world's largest population, close to 100 cities with populations of 1 million or more, high-speed trains to whisk passengers from one part of the country to another, innumerable airline connections to the rest of the world. All of these things mean that the conditions of modernity in China conduce to the rapid spread of a novel pathogen. They even have scientists who collect coronaviruses from the wild and study them in the laboratories. That too is a risk factor for pandemics. So all of these factors predispose China to being a country in which a novel pathogen of pandemic potential will emerge. All the same, China has not, in the case of the novel coronavirus, been a country in which the emergence of a novel pathogen, I'm presuming it emerged there, we don't know for sure, it's been a country in which the emergence of a novel pathogen has not erupted into a pandemic. The numbers of infections and deaths per million in China have been held to astonishingly low levels. The healthcare system has not collapsed, and its economic activity has recovered quickly. I mean, what's more, China may very well have been ground zero for the virus. I mean, it was the first country to identify the new contagion. While that doesn't mean the virus originated there, there's a good chance it did. And yet, this communist-led country has emerged almost unscathed. Now, in May 2021, so more than a year into the pandemic, the World Health Organization released a report by its independent panel on the performance of the world's governments in responding to the COVID-19 health emergency. And the panel arrived at a stunning conclusion. And the conclusion was that the pandemic could have been avoided, that it was not inevitable, that we need not have endured 2 years and counting of clogged hospitals, of canceled surgeries, burned out nurses and doctors, of supply chain disruptions, of closed businesses, closed schools, millions afflicted by long COVID, and possibly as many as 20 million deaths to date, according to excess death estimates. So if the WHO World Health Organization expert panel is correct, all of this could have been avoided. According to the panel, the pandemic wasn't inevitable even as late as January 30th, 2020, the day the World Health Organization declared a public health emergency of international concern. That was about 2 to 3 months after the virus likely first began to circulate, even at that late date. In the panel's view, the pandemic wasn't inevitable. The panel reported that it was still possible at that date to interrupt virus spread, provided that countries put in place strong measures to detect disease early, provided they isolated and treated cases, and traced contacts and promoted social distancing measures commensurate with the risk. But that didn't happen in most places. By March 11th, the virus had spread far enough that the Global Health Organization declared a pandemic. So how had an avoidable pandemic become a catastrophe on a world scale? And the answer, according to the panel, was very simple. The answer was inaction. It reported on 30 January 2020, it should have been clear to all the countries from the declaration of the public health emergency of international concern that COVID-19 represented a serious threat. Even so, continued the panel, only a minority of countries set in motion comprehensive and coordinated COVID-19 protection and response measures. The result was, the panel concluded, that February 20th, or 2020, a month when steps could and should have been taken to prevent a controllable outbreak, was lost to history. Instead, governments tarried and their foot dragging plunged the world into a dark abyss. Not all governments, however, were content to sit tight until it was absolutely certain they were staring disaster in the face. The panel pointed to a number of governments, a number of countries, pointed to China, New Zealand, Republic of Korea, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam. The panel said all of these countries acted quickly and decisively to contain the emergency, and all with exemplary success. It said that these countries pursued an aggressive containment strategy that involved mass testing, robust contact tracing, and quarantine with social and economic support to promote widespread uptake of public health measures. The panel failed to mention North Korea, but the DPRK also acted swiftly. I mean, it sealed its borders on January 21st, even before the World Health Organization declared a global health emergency. The country's leader, Kim Jong-un, called pandemic control North Korea's top priority and most important work. The Washington Post noted that Pyongyang had taken the pandemic hyper seriously Well, the New York Times observed that North Korea has taken some of the most drastic actions of any country against the virus. Now, these reports of North Korea taking the virus hyper seriously are consistent with the country's claim that it has experienced not a single COVID-19 case. Howard Waiskin, a physician with a PhD in sociology, critically examined North Korea's COVID-19 claim in monthly review and concluded Pyongyang's report of 0 cases and 0 deaths is plausible, and that the DPRK may in fact lead the world in the fight against COVID-19. Most other countries, by contrast, waited far too long to act. And when they did act, they failed to do enough. They never fully implemented the measures needed to bring their outbreaks under control. What's more, they almost invariably dialed back measures too soon with catastrophic consequences for public health. So this invites the question, why did most countries do too little, too late? And in an attempt to answer that question, the panel pointed to cost. So most governments judged concerted public health action, so the aggressive test, trace, and isolate measures implemented by China and a handful of other countries, as too expensive. 3 costs were central to these countries' concerns. First was the direct cost of mounting a testing, contact tracing program, of constructing isolation facilities, of coordinating quarantine, and providing financial support to the quarantine. Second was the indirect cost of business disruptions. And the third was the impact on the stock market. Now, concerning the first cost, according to Michael Lewis, the best-selling author who wrote a study of the US response to the COVID-19 pandemic, which he titled The Premonition, a Pandemic Story. According to Lewis, the people inside the US government who would be charged with executing various aspects of any pandemic strategy believed none of these non-pharmaceutical interventions, so the kind China pursued to great effect, would contribute anything but economic loss. Concerning the second cost, the cost of business disruption, the great influenza of 1918 to 1920, or what is more commonly known as the Spanish flu, that offered a kind of an anticipatory model of what might happen. So studies of how the United States responded to that pandemic found that government decision makers were under incessant pressure from businesses to lift public health measures. And those cities that capitulated to those pressures fared worse than those that did not. Well, now as then, capitalist governments are highly influenced by business communities and finely attuned to satisfying their needs. And minimizing the cost of business has been the top priority of governments working out how to deal with a global health crisis. And then finally, Donald Trump deliberately downplayed the public health emergency, repeatedly declaring that it would magically resolve itself because he feared that acknowledging the danger would result in untold stock market losses. According to the Washington Post, Trump grew concerned that any strong action by his administration would hurt the economy and told advisors that he did not want the administration to do or say anything that would spook the markets. Well, the World Health Organization panel criticized countries for taking a wait and see attitude. But the attitude the government took was actually a take no strong action to avoid spooking the markets attitude. So, contrast China's aggressive approach with that of the United States. Xi Jinping. This is Xi Jinping. If infectious disease control is not merely a matter of public health and hygiene, it's an all-encompassing issue and a total war. Versus Donald Trump. One day it's like a miracle. It will disappear. Well, China's success in protecting the health of its citizens from COVID-19 is, in my view, perhaps the greatest public health achievement in human history. By contrast, the United States' dismal COVID-19 performance is perhaps one of the greatest public health failures of all time. Now, despite the fact that the first COVID-19 cases were identified in China, and the country's population is over four times that of the United States, the number of confirmed cases in the United States surpassed China as early as March 26, 2020. So only 2 weeks after the World Health Organization declared a pandemic. 3 days later, US COVID deaths had already exceeded China's and have continued to climb, with the gap between the two countries unremittingly increasing. I mean, the disparity between the US and Chinese figures, which is little mentioned in Western public discourse. And when it is mentioned, there's a tendency to understate the disparity. But this disparity is astonishing. I mean, by the end of 2021, there were nearly 55 million cases or confirmed cases of COVID-19 in the United States, compared to slightly over 100,000 in the far more populous China. Number of people who had tested positive for COVID-19 was over 164,000 per million in the United States, compared to only 71 per million in China. And incredibly, deaths per million in the United States were over 770 times greater than in China. I mean, now, over 900,000 US Americans have died from COVID-19, making the outbreak the greatest death event measured in absolute numbers of deaths in US history. This exceeds US fatalities in World War I, in World War II, in the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Great Influenza of 1918 to 1920, and even the Civil War. And meanwhile, in China, fewer than 5,000 have died, less than 0.6% of the US figure. I mean, there have been 3.2 COVID deaths per million in China, compared to 2,656 deaths per million in the United States. I mean, the Chinese figure is less than 0.2% of the US number. So in terms of pandemic control, China and the United States are on completely different planets. And we can ask, whether China is the anomaly or the United States is the anomaly. And the answer is that both are anomalies. When you compare the two countries to the world at large, China has performed anomalously better, and the United States anomalously worse. So at the end of 2021, confirmed cases per million were over 500 times better in China than the world average, and over 4 times worse than the world average in the United States. Confirmed deaths were over 200 times better in China than the world average, that is confirmed deaths per million, but over 3.5 times worse in the United States. With only 4% of the world's population, the United States accounts for 19% of cases and 15% of deaths, while China, which comprises 18% of the world's population, accounts for less than 0.1% of the world's cases and a similarly infinitesimal fraction of the world's deaths. So we might ask, how many lives were needlessly sacrificed to the stock market and to Washington's desire to spare the business community the expense and inconveniences of public health measures? And it's possible to answer this question, or at least to provide an estimate. And had Washington emulated China's approach, an estimated 1,067 US Americans would have died from COVID-19 by the end of 2021. That's equivalent to the number of COVID-19 deaths China experienced adjusted to the size of the US population. That's over 800,000 fewer deaths than the actual US death toll to that date. So in other words, to protect the stock market and avoid the costs of implementing stringent non-pharmaceutical public health measures, the lives of more than 800,000 US Americans were sacrificed to the end of 2021. And many more lives continue to be sacrificed and will continue to be sacrificed to the Moloch of capitalism. So what if the world as a whole had followed China's lead? Well, we can estimate what would have happened. I mean, not only would the pandemic have been aborted in embryo, as per the World Health Organization expert panel, but if we assume it hadn't been aborted and stringent public health measures were put in place, and an estimated 25,000 people would have died from COVID-19 compared to over 5.4 million that actually did perish to the end of 2021, not counting collateral deaths due to the pandemic stress on healthcare systems and medical resources. So the failure of the world's governments to act in a manner that China early on had demonstrated was an effective means of controlling the outbreak created in excess of 5.4 million preventable deaths some 2 years after the world became aware of the novel coronavirus. So given that China has been so successful, the question is, well, what exactly has China done to outperform the United States and the rest of the world? And the answer is that Beijing takes COVID elimination seriously, perhaps more seriously than any other country, with the possible exception of North Korea. According to the New York Times, China always set zero as their goal. That's the key. China set zero as its goal. And some other countries have set zero as their goal. And there's no particular genius in China's approach. I mean, Beijing's strategy is based on an axiom. As Michael Lewis explained in The Premonition, one thing that is inarguably true is that if you got everyone and locked each of them in their own room and didn't let them out to talk to anyone, you would not have any disease. And China's approach is based loosely on this core truth. So, I mean, Beijing's initial response to the outbreak was to lock down Wuhan, the city in which the disease was first identified. So only one member of each household was permitted to leave their place of residence every few days to gather provisions. So this was a variation on Lewis's approach of lock everyone into their room and don't let them out until the disease is gone. So within a matter of weeks, the city's 11 million people were tested for the virus. 16 temporary hospitals were rapidly built to isolate people with mild to moderate symptoms. And because patients weren't quarantined, or rather were quarantined in a hospital and weren't quarantined at home, family residents did not become petri dishes for the growth and transmission of the virus. If a patient's condition worsened, they were transferred to a regular hospital. So by March 10th, the outbreak had been brought under control and temporary hospitals are no longer needed. So after 76 days, infections had been driven to zero and the city was reopened. At the same time, Beijing rapidly set up a countrywide contact tracing system, eventually developing a highly stringent definition of contact. So anyone who has been in a building 4 days before or after a person who develops COVID-19 symptoms or tests positive for the disease is deemed a contact and quarantined. Now, this may appear to be draconian and may appear to be a measure guaranteed to gather large numbers of people in its web, but it should be remembered that case numbers in China are exceedingly low. In fact, they're so low that the odds of encountering an infected person are less than the odds of being struck by lightning. And as a result, only a small fraction of the population ever gets caught in this web. Well, having eliminated the disease within its borders, China has implemented additional measures to minimize the chances the virus will seep into the country from outside. So travelers require special government approval to enter the country, and those who receive visas are required to quarantine for weeks. And quarantine is required for all travelers, including those who are fully vaccinated. Now, these controls are not infallible. I mean, occasionally the virus evades border restrictions and slips into the country. And when it does, public health authorities act quickly and decisively. For example, when 9 airport cleaners at one airport tested positive during routine testing, the city in which the airport is located immediately imposed lockdowns and tested its 9.3 million residents in just 2 weeks. Now, the former chief epidemiologist of the Chinese Center for Disease Control and Prevention describes China's strategy as one that, quote, one that doesn't simply treat infected patients, but cuts off the disease infection routes by screening out and quarantining every close contact or potential virus carrier through prompt epidemiological investigations. In other words, China simply follows the tenets of epidemiology 101. Now, here's how the British Medical Journal described China's approach. Quoting from the journal, China mobilized quickly and within 2 months had contained the epidemic and eliminated local infections in the country. There were no magic bullets in the tools it used. The methods were old school public health strategies, which are often called non-pharmacological interventions. Other countries also successfully eliminated local infection, showing that elimination of an emerging disease with pandemic potential is possible by using non-pharmaceutical interventions alone. So just to make an aside, non-pharmaceutical interventions alone, it's possible to eliminate an emerging disease with pandemic potential by using methods other than vaccination. Public health methods such as mask wearing, hand washing, social distancing, and restriction of public events and travel played an important part. Identifying and quarantining people with COVID-19 and their close contacts was also critical, so unquote. So China's success then has been due not to vaccines, the lodestone of the West pandemic response, but to old school public health strategies the World Health Organization describe as proven and known to work. Well, in an April 2021 study, The Lancet, the prestigious British medical journal, compared 5 OECD countries that pursued what's called the Elimination Strategy, or China's zero COVID strategy. Compared these 5 countries with 32 other OECD countries that opted for what's called hospital surveillance-based mitigation. That is a strategy that does not set zero as the goal, but sets as its goal as many cases as are tolerable within the limits of hospital capacity and current medical resources. So the study pointed to the following OECD countries as countries which pursued China's elimination or zero COVID strategy: Australia, Iceland, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea. They imposed tight border controls. They developed test, trace, and quarantine methods to eliminate community transmission. So the study's authors compared the 2 groups on COVID-19 deaths, on GDP growth, and on the strictness of lockdown measures during the first 12 months of the pandemic. Here's what they found. The mortality rate was 25 times lower among countries that set zero as their goal. Lockdown measures were less strict and of shorter duration in the zero COVID group. And GDP growth returned to pre-pandemic levels in early 2021 in the 5 countries that set zero as their goal, whereas growth was still negative for the other 32 OECD countries. On the basis of their analysis, the authors concluded that governments that pursue a zero COVID strategy that set zero as their goal not only perform better at protecting the health of their citizens and saving lives, but also better protect their economies and minimize restrictions on civil liberties compared with those that allow cases to rise to the tolerable limit of their healthcare system or beyond. Now, the New York Times noted that in many countries, there have been debates have raged over the balance between protecting public health and keeping the economy running. The Lancet study showed that the debate is based on a false dichotomy. And protecting public health and keeping the economy running are not antithetical goals. On the contrary, the countries that perform best at protecting public health also do best at keeping their economies running. The New York Times noted that in China, there's little debate. Rather than opting for public health over the economy or the economy over public health, Beijing protected both. And indeed, in 2020, China's economy was the only major world economy to grow in a year ravaged by the pandemic, according to the Wall Street Journal. Well, if Beijing set zero as its goal, Washington set protecting the stock market and avoiding disruptions to business as its goal, along with one other, and that was developing a vaccine. From day one, all expert talk in the United States was about how to speed the production and distribution of vaccines, observed Michael Lewis. No one seemed to be exploring the most efficient and least disruptive ways to remove people from social networks, the method China pursued with great success. Lewis wrote that there's no difference between giving a person a vaccine and removing him or her from their social network, because in each case, a person loses the ability to infect others. In fact, Lewis failed to anticipate that the vaccines that have been developed do not prevent transmission. And in fact, removing a person from their social network is superior to giving them one of the vaccines that are currently available. All the same, in the United States, the vaccine was and remains king. Been regarded by the official cognoscente, the White House and its science advisors, the pharmaceutical industry, Bill Gates, and practically every mainstream journalist as the sole route, the sole route to an exit from the pandemic. Anthony Fauci even likened the vaccine to the cavalry. Well, anyone who lived in North America or Western Europe, or indeed just about anywhere in the world outside of China, would likely have heard repeatedly in the months following the viral outbreak that at some point, within a year, a vaccine would be developed, after which it would be quickly distributed, allowing humanity to put the pandemic behind it and all of us to resume our lives as before. Well, what we very likely didn't hear amid all the celebration of vaccines and how they would save us all was that China had already put the pandemic behind it. Even well before Russia won the vaccine race, introducing the first COVID-19 shot, aptly named Sputnik V, V for vaccine, to recall the other Sputnik, the first satellite in Russia's, or more precisely the Soviet Union's, victory in the race to space. Well, Fauci, the most visible infectious disease expert in the countries that orbit the United States, has appeared as the voice of reason and science against the obvious nonsense of the self-declared genius, Donald Trump. But Fauci spent most of his career overseeing research on vaccines and therapeutics as the solution to infectious disease. that's not the only approach to dealing with contagious afflictions. I mean, there is pharmaceutical intervention. There is also non-pharmaceutical intervention, testing, contact tracing, isolation, epidemiology 101. Well, Fauci's clearly on the pharmaceutical side. It's no surprise then that he promoted vaccines as the cavalry. But here's a question. How is it that Fauci, whose career inclines him to see solutions through the lens of pharmacy, became the go-to expert on how to beat the pandemic? And why was Bill Gates, who had spent years promoting vaccines, popping up everywhere, echoing Fauci, extolling the merits of inoculations? Now, to be sure, safe and effective vaccines are highly desirable, and they're responsible for saving countless millions of lives, and they represent a significant advance in public health. But are vaccines the gold standard for defeating the COVID-19 pandemic? Since the pandemic had already been defeated in some parts of the world without recourse to vaccines, the single-minded focus on vaccines from March 2020 forward to the exclusion of zero COVID strategies, that requires an explanation. Surely any go-to expert on how to defeat the pandemic ought to have had a Chinese name. And yet, despite overwhelming evidence that a zero COVID strategy got results, the United States and its satellites laid all their bets on vaccines. And, admittedly, not all expert opinion was for vaccines. It's just that all expert opinion that mattered was. There were plenty of experts who warned that vaccination alone was not the way out of the pandemic. But no one in Washington was listening, or if they were, they didn't particularly care. The World Health Organization Director General counseled that vaccines alone will not get any country out of this crisis, and vaccines alone cannot solve the pandemic. He added, there's no silver bullet. Stopping outbreaks comes down to the basics of public health and disease control: testing, isolating, and treating patients, and tracing and quarantining their contacts. In other words, doing what China did. Dr. Leana Wen, is a public health professor at George Washington University, echoed Tedros. We should not be thinking of a vaccine as a silver bullet, she warned. Emma Cook, the executive director of the European Medicines Agencies of the EU's drug regulatory body, said the same. Vaccines alone will not be the silver bullet that will allow us to return to normal life. Dr. Peter Hotez, who's the dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine, he joined the chorus. Vaccines, he said, are not magic solutions. Simon Clark, professor of cellular microbiology at the University of Reading, observed that there's been an attitude in some quarters that a vaccine is our automatic savior. Well, vaccines are really important, he said. They are not a silver bullet. Martin McKee, a professor of public health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, put it bluntly. Anyone who says that vaccines alone can end the pandemic is wrong. And yet, that's what expert opinion at the White House said. The Trump White House, the original champion of the vaccine strategy, announced that it was fully focused on defeating the virus through a vaccine. The New York Times noted that while the administration approached the pandemic in a confused manner, poorly coordinated, ad hoc, largely apathetic, the exception was its attention to developing a vaccine, which was methodical, which was concerted, which evinced a strong commitment. Well, then we have Biden following Trump's lead on pandemic response, as on so many other files from China to Iran. Biden announced vaccination is the key to getting the pandemic under control and keeping the economy strong. Well, apparently he's wrong. The availability of vaccine doses for every US American adult, led Biden to effectively declare the COVID-19 pandemic over in the summer of 2021, despite the fact that the United States continued to post among the world's worst COVID-19 morbidity and mortality figures. It was as if the White House defined the end of the pandemic as the day vaccines or the cavalry arrived. Campaigning for president in the autumn of 2020, Biden launched an attack on Trump. He said, anyone who's responsible for that many deaths should not remain as president of the United States of America. Well, at the time, 220,000 US Americans had died of COVID-19. 10 months into Biden's presidency, the death toll had climbed by a further 350,000, so more than under Trump's presidency, which led the Wall Street Journal to editorialize, well, it would seem that Mr. Biden has done no better than Donald Trump, despite the benefit of vaccines. In a related way, the US pharmaceutical industry chimed in with a panegyric to itself. So one drug company executive said, "We led the world in responding to this pandemic," apparently unaware that China had kept the COVID-19 death toll to a minuscule fraction of the US toll per capita without the US pharmaceutical industry's leadership. And as to major newspapers, they continue to propagate nonsense about how vaccines are the main weapon fighting the pandemic, which is true outside of China and a few other countries, but only in the sense that it's the only weapon left after the one that has been proved able to slay the COVID-19 dragon, the zero COVID approach, was rejected. It's too costly and a danger to the stock market. Now, the World Health Organization's assessment of the world's response to the pandemic noted that, while much of the early response to COVID-19 involved missed opportunities and failure to act, there were some areas in which early action was taken to good effect, most notably in research and development, and in particular, vaccine development. Well, that invites a question. Why did much of the world fail to incur the costs necessary to curtail the epidemic and forestall the pandemic, but succeeded so notably in vaccine product development? While the vaccine-centric approach has been the approach favored by decision makers in most mid to high-income countries, there were plenty of reasons it should have been regarded with extreme skepticism, and indeed was regarded with extreme skepticism within the scientific community. Throughout the first half of 2020 and into the summer of that year, there were serious doubts about whether humans could develop a durable immunity to the novel coronavirus. There are 4 coronaviruses that produce the common cold, against which no vaccine has ever been developed. If the novel coronavirus was like coronavirus common colds, then a vaccine effort was doomed to failure. The World Health Organization reminded governments that the question of whether humans could acquire immunity to the virus had yet to be answered. And yet, governments were forging ahead with a vaccine strategy. As late as October 2020, The Lancet would report that there is no evidence for lasting protective immunity to SARS-CoV-2 following natural infection. Even Anthony Fauci expressed concern. He said, when you look at the history of the common coronaviruses that cause the common cold, the reports in the literature are that the durability of immunity that's protective ranges from 3 to 6 months. Now, Fauci was optimistic that humans could acquire immunity, but pointed out that immune response was only a necessary and not a sufficient condition of vaccine success. He said, or warned, there's never, ever a guarantee that you're going to get an effective vaccine. And yet, that's where effort was concentrated. So, the state of the art in vaccine development in early 2020, when decisions were being made about how to tackle COVID-19, was that almost all vaccine efforts failed. Looking at the history of vaccine development, only 6% of development efforts have succeeded or had succeeded to that point. And the very few that did succeed took a long time to come to fruition. The thinking at that point was that a new vaccine would likely take between 10 to 15 years to develop. Of the 6% of vaccine efforts that did succeed, the average development time was 10.7 years. So scientists saw little chance a COVID-19 vaccine would be quickly developed. What people don't realize is that normally vaccine development takes many years, sometimes decades. Virologist Dan Barouche, that's what he told the New York Times. Robert Van Exen, a veteran of the US vaccine industry, assessed the probability of a safe and effective COVID vaccine as relatively low. So the consensus among scientists was that a vaccine, if it arrived, wouldn't arrive soon. So anyone reviewing the state of the art in 2020 would have reasonably concluded that the chance of a vaccine being developed was poor, which raises the question, if vaccine success appeared to be unlikely, and non-pharmaceutical public health measures had already been shown to be effective, why were billions of dollars invested in a project that looked destined to fail, while at the same time a demonstrably effective solution to the crisis was rejected? Now, David Sanger, the high-profile veteran reporter with the New York Times, at the time, before the vaccine had been developed, he raised doubts about whether a vaccine was possible. And I mentioned this just to reflect the thinking at the time. He also pointed to another concern, which is safety. The whole enterprise, he wrote, remains dogged by uncertainty about whether any coronavirus vaccine will prove effective, how fast it could be made available to millions or billions of people, and whether the rush, comprising a process that can take 10 years into 10 months, will sacrifice safety. The answer, it turned out, was that safety was indeed sacrificed. In fact, it was only by sacrificing safety that vaccines could be produced quickly, which doesn't mean necessarily that the vaccines are unsafe. But what it means is that the protocols normally in place to assess safety were sidestepped in an effort to fast track the vaccines. So here's how Sanger explained it. Because of the pandemic's urgency, any promising COVID-19 vaccine is likely to be fast-tracked through the testing and approval process. It may not, and indeed it did not, go through years of clinical trials and careful studies of possible long-term side effects the way other drugs do, and also the way vaccines normally do. So as Sanger predicted, the vaccines were rushed into people's arms before clinical trials were completed and before sufficient time had elapsed to evaluate possible long-term side effects to meet a medical emergency, which turned out to be an option and was not inevitable. And the pessimism of scientists, if you go back and read what scientists were saying before the vaccine was actually developed, and they were pessimistic, and you wonder, why were they so pessimistic? Were they just pessimistic people? Were they inept? No, the pessimism of the scientists who predicted in 2020 that a vaccine could not possibly be produced in 12 months can be forgiven because they were assuming, wrongly it turned out, that, like other vaccines, a COVID-19 vaccine would require a period of testing over many years. So, for example, Walter Orenstein, associate director of the Emory Vaccine Center in Atlanta, told the Wall Street Journal that he was skeptical a safe and effective vaccine could be available soon, given all the testing required. What he didn't know was that all the testing required wouldn't be done. And had normal testing protocols been followed, it would have taken 2 years or more to develop a COVID vaccine. And safe vaccines may never have been developed. We don't know. Had trials lasted their planned 2 years, they may have uncovered mid to long-term safety concerns that would have ruled out approval of the shot. Well, here's a puzzle. In 2020, the Rockefeller Foundation presented a proposal to the Trump administration on how to tackle the COVID-19 pandemic. The Rockefeller Foundation said, invest $100 billion in a health corps of 300,000 public servants to conduct a countrywide test, trace, and quarantine program, emulating the strategy that allowed China to bring its outbreak under control and safely reopen its economy. The White House peremptorily dismissed this proposal. Instead, Washington decided to spend tens of billions of dollars on a vaccine supported by the logistical expertise of the US military. That same military logistical capability could have been leveraged to create and operate a test, trace, and isolate program. It wasn't. So why, with the pandemic upon it, would Washington turn down an approach to pandemic control that had been shown to be successful in China in favor of going all in on a vaccine program, which in the first half of 2020 appeared to any reasonable person to have little chance of success? I mean, why pass on the sure thing and bet on the long shot? Well, I think one driver of Washington's predilection for vaccines was the ability of billionaires such as Bill Gates to set the public health agenda to favor pharmaceutical solutions. Now, owing to their great wealth, I mean, billionaires like Gates and others, and foundations supported by wealthy people and large corporations in the pharmaceutical industry, have strongly influenced public discourse on healthcare issues and have set the public policy agenda on matters related to health, including pandemic preparedness. And they've long ago used their influence to push vaccines, pharmaceutical interventions more broadly. So these are a potential cornucopia of profits. They push these to the top of the agenda on how to meet the challenge of future pandemics. And as a result, when the pandemic hit, governments followed the path capitalist influencers had already set, eschewing the proven public health measures, which, though unquestionably effective, offer few or no opportunities for amassing great profits. Now, additionally, Washington has been planning for how to meet the threat of a biological attack or warfare carried out without germs. And always the response has been seen to depend mainly on developing and stockpiling two things: vaccines and personal protective equipment. Vaccines and PPE, however, are not the only ways to address germ threats, but the idea is so ingrained in public discourse that when asked how humanity ought to prepare for another pandemic, the answer is almost invariably, well, let's make sure we have enough N95 masks and build vaccine manufacturing infrastructure. But there is another model of pandemic preparation that's almost always overlooked: develop the infrastructure to test, trace, and isolate. And this rejection of public health measures may in part reflect borrowed thinking from the military. I mean, the standard way of defending military forces from weaponized pathogens are to equip troops with biohazard suits and respirators and to vaccinate them. tests, trace, and isolates absent from military doctrine on defense against biological threats because it's ill-suited to the military environment. I mean, blindly importing this military anti-biological threat doctrine into public health practice, emits an effective technique that, while it's ill-suited for military purposes, works very well in a civilian realm. Well, and then there are a number of other mutually reinforcing factors, I think, that led Washington to favor vaccination. First, non-pharmaceutical public health measures are contraindicated under a capitalist system. I mean, rather than spending billions of dollars on vaccines, billions could have been spent on a robust public health response, such as the one proposed by the Rockefeller Foundation. But the problem from a capitalist perspective is that a public sector program to hire hundreds of thousands of public services to carry out old school public health measures offers few, if any, profit-making opportunities for the private sector. I mean, shoe leather epidemiology, is the unsung labor of public servants. On the other hand, vaccine production can be quickly and easily made a private sector activity, which offers a rich banquet of profits on which investors, which are Washington's principal clients, on which they can gorge and have gorged. And then additionally, Washington has no desire to promote the public sector except as a complement to private enterprise. The capitalist class, the US state, individual billionaires such as Gates agree that free enterprise must be the main vehicle through which the world's problems are addressed. There's no room in this view for the public sector except as a host for private enterprise parasitism in the source of the private sector's new products, such as mRNA vaccines produced at taxpayer expense in government laboratories and then transferred to private enterprise for the benefit of private investors. The writer and journalist Nina Burleigh observed that the White House focus has been on its conviction that private enterprise is the way out of the disaster. So not only are vaccines to be understood as the exit from the calamity, but vaccines produced by the private sector are to be presented as the only possible escape. Burleigh also argued that Washington's incompetence, evidence in its failure to prevent over 900,000 US citizens from dying to date, that this is deliberate, that the White House could seize the levers of public power to bring the pandemic under control by dint of old school public health measures, but it chooses not to in order to avoid giving hope to US citizens that government, unhinged from its service role to the bourgeoisie, can be a force for good, by which I mean one that serves the proletariat. So, just to conclude, as COVID scythes through the world, or rather as it scythed through much of the world outside of China and a few other countries, in a diminishing list of countries, because most countries that adopted, or the few countries that adopted the zero COVID approach, most of them have abandoned it. Well, as COVID scythes through the world outside those countries, it continues to create this mounting pile of corpses. Many observers believe that the true toll to date, when we take into account not only confirmed cases, but collateral cases, is probably 19 million. So this virus is a killer, but it is a killer that is able to kill because it has a helper, and it has a henchman, and the henchman is capitalism. Capitalism discouraged governments from acting quickly and decisively to abort a public health crisis in embryo for fear of spooking markets and disrupting business activity. Capitalism stayed the hand of those who sought to implement the non-pharmaceutical public health measures that China demonstrated could eliminate the virus and allow economies to reopen quickly and safely. Capitalism pushed governments to accept vaccines produced by the private enterprise. In fact, vaccines produced, in fact, in government labs and then transferred to the private enterprise as the only exit from the pandemic, and to rush them into people's arms before they were adequately tested to address a medical emergency that need not have happened. Capitalism forced the public to accept the economic risks and costs of vaccine development, those vaccines developed in public labs, while privatizing the economic gains by transferring the new technology to private actors. And then after defining vaccines as the pandemic's off-ramp, capitalism prevented vaccine technology from being shared with humanity as a public good, thereby slowing vaccine deployment around the world and delaying the day this viral holocaust would be brought to an end. So the killer's henchman is capitalism. And I believe that no effective response to future pandemics or to the emergence of future pathogens, potentially pandemic pathogens, that no effective response to these is possible until that henchman is dead. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. That was an incredibly, a terrific presentation. What we're going to do right now is just take a quick break. I'll make some announcements. Next week, we're going to have a program on Ukraine. Stay tuned. We're working on getting some speakers lined up. It should be a good session with discussion and presentation of views about what's going on in Ukraine, a real hot spot in the world today. I want to call your attention to our fundraising appeal on our website. You can go to ICSSmarks.org and donate to the ICSS to support the Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library activities. We do have expenses, and we appreciate people who make one-time donations as well as an ongoing commitment through Patreon or just a bank transfer every month to help us keep these programs going. I think it's pretty clear from the presentation today, this is our small little corner of the world here is one of the few places that you can actually get the truth about what's going on in the world today. And I think it's really worth, it's a campaign and a program that's really worth sustaining. So please donate and sign up for our mailing list on our website. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to shift into question and answers. I would ask you all to go down to the bottom of your screen when you're on Zoom, the reactions button, and raise your hand to ask questions. And I will generally take them in order. I'm going to start with Raj, who has his hand up. Then I'm going to go to Laura Wells and then Jean. So Raj, if you would unmute yourself and ask your question.
Unmuted, and here's my real face. Okay, thank you, Steve. Very well presented discussion, lecture. I do have, and I appreciate a lot in what you have said, but I think I want to raise some issues with your framework for your talk. You're saying the henchman is capitalism for this. I mean, I think pandemic is how the outcome is related to the systems in which societies live, and not having a response, social response that puts people ahead of profit is a major cause for the spread, a wider spread. But so, I mean, if capitalism is versus socialism is the issue, why is Taiwan's death rate from COVID is only 35 per million, whereas Cuba, a socialist country where nobody here doubts that, is 843 per million. So, and in China is even smaller, okay? But I think the action they took, which is a very strong action to isolate people, so that's the point you're making. But is that possible in a society like United States or much of Western Europe, where they have a tradition of a lot of freedom for individuals rather than take the states? In China, people follow the state much more readily. But in Western countries, the traditions are different. You didn't take that into account in your talk and basically summarized it as capitalism versus socialism issue. The third one I'm saying is that China may have acted responsibly towards its citizen, and even though very harsh measures were put in effect, they were guilty towards the world early on. When the virus actually appeared, was identified by a doctor, okay, who was shut up later on to die, and informing the WHO was delayed by a month after the Chinese knew. They knew towards the end of December, and it was not until towards the end of January, which allowed the virus to escape to many countries. And country like United States and Europe, where there's a lot of travel, unlike some other countries where there's less travel, virus will move much more quickly. So these are my comments. And the main thing I'm posing to you is that your conclusion is socialism versus capitalism isn't quite right, because China, by that model, would be called socialist. And I don't think you can apply that label to China anymore. It may have had better view of its citizens, but the harsh measures it took are not possible to be taken in other societies. So these are individual variation that you have not taken into account. So please react to these things. But thank you very much for a very informative talk.
Well, let me react to your main point by asking you a question. What is it that I have said that suggests that I'm suggesting that this is a capitalism versus socialism issue?
Oh, well,
because that's a complete misrepresentation of my presentation and position. I do not hold that view. I'm curious as to why you think I do.
Well, it follows.
What did I say? What did I say to suggest that?
Well, it follows.
Tell me that.
Yeah, from your talk where you gave statistics, North Korea literally has reports.
Yes, North Korea. I didn't say capitalism versus socialism. I didn't say this is an advantage of communism and this only. In fact, you may have noticed that I said a number of countries pursued a zero COVID approach. I would contest that. I mean, I have no idea how you arrived at this view, and that kind of troubles me, because I didn't say one thing that suggested that.
Well,
let's put it this way. No, I don't believe that to be the case. So don't tell me that that's a failure of my presentation when you're attributing to me a view I do not have and do not present. So perhaps you weren't listening very closely. The second point about systems and about civil liberties, I mean, that's a wonderful idea. That's an excuse that's widely distributed in mainstream media to excuse the United States for not imposing public health measures. Well, you know, it's not the case, for example, like a country in Canada, which is very similar to the United States. It's not the case that Canadians do not accept public health measures. In fact, most Canadians support them. How do you know in the United States that US citizens would not support the kinds of public health measures that China and other zero COVID countries pursued? For example, Australia, for example, New Zealand. No, these are not communist countries. these are not countries like China or Vietnam, but they are countries that supported a zero COVID approach. This is a silly idea that, you know, the United States is filled with a bunch of people who are committed to civil liberties and they would never accept any kind of encroachment upon their civil liberties. Also, you perhaps weren't paying attention when I talked about the Lancet study that compared the OECD countries. Again, OECD countries, none of which are socialist or communist, that pursued zero COVID strategy approaches. Do you recall when I talked about that study that compared them to the OECD countries that pursued a hospital-based surveillance mitigation strategy? And that study found that, in fact, the countries that pursued the zero COVID approach had a better approach to civil liberties. And why? Because the lockdowns weren't as severe and the lockdowns were brief. And why were they brief? Because you quash the virus immediately. You don't do what the United States did or Canada did, which is you take these half measures and then the virus overwhelms hospitals, and then you have to, reply with very stringent lockdown measures, and then you lift them again, and then you watch hospitals fill up, and then you have to impose them again, and it seems to go on endlessly. So, those countries that pursued the zero COVID approach, in fact, were happier with their governments. They did better. They were perceived as doing better, not only economically, not only in terms of saving lives, but also in terms of civil liberties. So the civil liberties argument is a silly argument. And it's just an argument used to excuse countries for their failure.
May I respond to that, Alan?
Yeah, go ahead briefly, but then we're going to move on, please.
Pointed in his criticism of me. Now, first of all, I think it's very implicit in your talk about when you say the henchman is capitalism. I've just pointed out the henchmen of capitalism exist in China as well, okay? And secondly, by delaying that information, China acted irresponsibly towards the world community. So that's one thing.
Second, I'm not saying that China is not, I'm not saying that China does not have capitalism. I recognize that China has capitalism. We can have a discussion about China. If you want to read the book, you'll see that there's a long discussion about China and whether you can call it socialist or capitalist. And how is it that some countries that are capitalist manage to pursue a zero COVID approach? So I'm sorry if I gave that impression, but that is not the argument I make. And if you look at my book and read it, you'll discover that I don't make that argument. I am not arguing that. I'm saying capitalism is the henchman because capitalism essentially allows countries to pursue the kind of approach, predisposes them. I'm not taking this mechanistic view that says it's a probabilistic view. It's a far more sophisticated view than you have this black and white capitalism versus socialism. Well, maybe we're exactly on the same page. And what troubles me is you're attributing to me views that I don't have, and that you're suggesting that my presentation and view is far more simplistic than in fact it actually is. So I hope that satisfies you. And if you read the book, you'll discover that you probably agree with me 99%. Okay?
That clarification, I just had a couple more things.
Well, actually, Raj, I think we need to move. We have 5 people have their hands up. So okay. let's move on.
All right, well, stay fine.
Okay. Laura, if you would go ahead and unmute yourself, followed by Jean, Richard, and then Sharon.
Okay, my question actually has to do with Cuba, because at first it had very good statistics about COVID, and then at some point it got, it had worse statistics, and so I just wonder what you can say about Cuba. Thank you.
It had good statistics for a number of reasons, one of which too was that there were border controls, but economic circumstances led China to open its borders. And when it opened its borders, there was an outbreak, one which it's managed to bring under control. But Cuba didn't pursue a zero COVID strategy quite as diligently as other countries did. Vietnam was the same. Vietnam was pursuing a very stringent zero COVID strategy, and then it opened its borders. And the virus seeped in or came in from the outside. All the same, despite the fact that Cuba, through this kind of economic necessity, had to abandon some of its pandemic control measures. And maybe we could argue that Vietnam also, through economic necessity, had to abandon some pandemic control measures, despite the fact that they haven't done as well as China. They still have done very well compared to other countries within the region and compared to other countries globally or in the world as a whole.
Okay.
And
yeah. Next up is Jean, if you would unmute yourself and ask your question. Jean.
I'm unmuted, I guess, but I'm still unvideoed. But
Go ahead. That's fine.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much. This was music to my ears. And unlike Raj, I do understand that China is exactly what it says it is. It's a socialist country led by a dictatorship of the proletariat. But this is something we've talked about before, and I'm always happy to talk more about it. But I did have some questions. I mean, I liked your presentation, very thought-provoking, but I still need to think some more about it. And there's some kind of questions I have or issues I'd like you to hit on. One is the question of the impeachment of Trump, because in the month of December and January, all politicians in the United States were concerned about impeaching Trump, and they're not about to turn to something that's minor as a global pandemic. So that's one feature that's in there that I am concerned about. Other is the issue of global pandemic. No, global, what is it? Vaccine apartheid. People have talked about it. Even if you take the vaccine approach, it's not going to work unless you vaccinate everybody in the world, including all those Africans and South Asianists and so forth that don't have access to the vaccine. So that's another aspect I'd like you to touch upon, maybe a little bit peripheral, but worth talking about. And on Taiwan, as we all know, Taiwan is not a country, it's an island. And even though this is the case, its response seems to be worth talking. I know you touched on it, but I wanted to again raise the issue. But again, thank you so much for this presentation. It's really, it's great. And we look forward to your next book on this and to you coming back again. So again, thank you.
thank you. You know, I should reiterate, it is clear to me very early on in addressing this that if you're anyone who tried to approach this as capitalism versus socialism was going to have trouble because there are too many things that would not be explained by that explanation. That obviously the approaches that various governments took is not a function solely of capitalism versus socialism. In fact, you'd have difficulty finding purely socialist countries to be able to point to as socialist examples, since countries like Vietnam and China obviously have large capitalist elements. And other countries that are capitalists have were very successful. A minority was very successful. But the real question was, why was a vaccine approach favored over approach that worked? Why was a vaccine approach, which looked at a certain point to be one that wasn't going to work, favored over an approach we knew would work? And I think part of the explanation for why obviously capitalist countries led by capitalist governments, some of which adopted a zero COVID strategy, was because it turned out there were two approaches that you could take within the capitalist world. There was the vaccine approach, which many took, the United States, obviously, Britain, Canada, Israel. Canada's approach, for example, was to use its money to buy vaccine doses. Canada bought something like 10 times more vaccine doses than its entire population. And other countries, capitalist countries led by capitalist governments, decided that rather than spending on buying vaccines, what they would do is invest their money in public health measures. So you had two approaches that capitalist governments had: vaccines or public health measures. They saw these as dichotomous. You could put your money here, you could put your money there. I can't recall where it was. I can't recall the country, but one country in particular, what it did was it said, we're doing very effectively, we're doing very well with public health measures. That's where we're putting our resources. But you know what? That's not how we're going to exit the pandemic. We have to exit the pandemic through vaccines. So we're taking all of our money out of public health measures, and now we're going to buy vaccines. So that's the approach. They transitioned from public health to vaccines, from non-pharmaceutical to pharmaceutical intervention. And when they made that transition, what happened? What happened was that infections rose, the number of deaths rose, because there was no way in which, as the World Health Organization says, you can vaccinate your way out of a pandemic. But that was the choice given capitalist countries. Vaccines, spend your money on vaccines, spend it on public health. Most chose to spend their money on vaccines. Now, to Gene's specific questions, the vaccine apartheid. I think the solution, one potential solution, it's an unrealistic solution, but in principle, the solution to COVID-19 or to a pandemic is a zero approach, the so-called elimination strategy. If every country in the world pursued the elimination strategy, there would be no pandemic. But that's not going to happen, and it isn't happening. So now you have to ask the question, well, given that not every country is going to pursue an elimination strategy, what do you do? What's the exit from the pandemic? And I think the exit from a pandemic, given that, involves vaccination. And as you pointed out, the exit from the pandemic involves universal vaccination. But universal vaccination isn't happening because we have vaccine hoarding, we have vaccine apartheid. And the estimates are that the world would be vaccinated, or all those who want a vaccine would eventually be vaccinated by 2024 or something like that. In the meantime, we have governments pursuing what's now called living with COVID. More and more and more governments are pursuing the living with COVID approach, which simply means doing nothing and allowing the infection to run wild. And the more it runs wild and the more it spreads, the more likely we'll have mutations, more variants. And mutations don't always become less virulent. They can become more virulent. So this could drag on endlessly, given the approach. I'm not sure that I understood your first point, Gene. It seemed to be more like a sardonic comment than anything about politicians being more concerned with impeaching Trump than with actually addressing something far more important, being a pandemic.
Well, that's one of the features we have I mean, isn't this a great country after all, that we could do things like that and impeach the terrorists? But again, I just want to reassert, but thank you very much, and I appreciate it. But I just want to reassert the Marxist-Leninist position that, from the viewpoint of scientific socialism, if you look at all the factors and see all the pros and cons, socialism serves the needs of humanity better than capitalism. And I think that's a clearly established procedure. I will stick to that. But thank you so much. Really appreciate your comments and giving me a lot to think about in the next few weeks.
Right.
Okay, next up is Richard Wright, followed by Sharon, followed by Roger, followed by Youssef. So Richard, if you would unmute yourself and ask your question, please.
Hi there, Steve. It was a nice presentation. I sort of feel kind of guilty for not yielding my time over to you and Raj again, but tough luck. First off, I noticed Nan has been putting some information in the chat. One thing I wanted to point out is Nathan Rich came up with a very good timeline on the Chinese response to the COVID virus that bears looking into. The other thing is that basically your presentation is a continuation of the old bourgeois democracy as a means of transferring public funding to private enterprise, which I adhere to. Question I had is a couple of questions. I think you mentioned, or somebody mentioned, Chinese harsh measures. And I was wondering what those were, one. And two, first off, there's a vast cultural difference between China in particular and the United States. Now I'm wondering how you would enforce. I mean, we've seen all these. How you enforce a lockdown, if that's what you're suggesting. You know, how you would enforce that. Thank you.
Well, on the cultural difference, again, I think this is wrong. I mean, there are cultural differences between the United States and China. I mean, no one's going to deny that. But we're talking about whether those cultural differences translate into the way in which people are going to react to public health measures. There was an interesting story in the New York Times about this. I was talking kind of about it. I was alluding to it. I was talking about the issue of public health versus the economy versus the public health. The New York Times doing an article that said, look, that's not even an issue in China because they decided that you could address both of them. And this was written at a time when there were lockdowns in the United States, in Canada, and the UK, and people were complaining about having to meet on Zoom, and you couldn't see your friends, and you couldn't go out and go down to a coffee shop and talk to people. And the article pointed out that, in fact, in China, people were doing all of these things, all the things that we talked about that we wanted to do and that we missed. And that these people who are occupying my city right now say that they all miss. They're looking for freedom. Well, those people, that's what was happening in China. The New York Times said, look, Chinese people are going out to dinner. They go to theaters. They go to movies. They do all of these things. Why do they do it? Because local infections have been eliminated, because they took it seriously from the beginning. And they quashed it when it was still small rather than allowing it to run rampant and riot as we did in the Western world, or most of the Western world. So are there cultural differences? Yeah, there are cultural differences, but that doesn't mean that people in the Western world wouldn't accept these kinds of restrictions. Now, the New York Times now and the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post have now been promoting the zero COVID approach, point to China and say, well, how could they continue to pursue that approach? I mean, it's so draconian, it's so harsh, but it's not draconian and harsh. It seems draconian and harsh when you say a contact is described as someone who was in a building 4 days before someone tested positive and 4 days after. But as I pointed out, because cases are so small in China, that the likelihood of any individual in China being caught up in what seems to be very their lockdown measures is very small. Most people in China live their lives without restrictions for the most part. And those restrictions, when they're imposed, are imposed quickly and decisively, and the virus is eliminated, and then the restrictions are lifted. But you know, if you impose restrictions on a city of 3 million in China, what percentage of the Chinese population has been inconvenienced? That's a very small percentage of the population. So yes, when you describe these lockdown measures, these restrictions, these public health measures, they seem austere, but they don't get imposed on large parts of the population. And when they are imposed quickly, and they're lifted fairly quickly as well. They don't go through the same, you know, recurring pattern of lockdown, lift, lockdown, lift, lockdown, lift, all of which, well, I won't talk about it now, but there's a reason there is a lockdown, lift, lockdown, lift, lockdown, lift. It's part of the so-called hospital-based surveillance strategy. Anyway, I'll leave that. I discuss that in my book, and I discuss what's behind the strategies the Western world has pursued. And what's behind them is we've heard about mitigation, we heard about bending the curve, we heard about flattening the curve. People usually don't ask, what do you mean by flattening the curve, and what are you hoping to achieve? Well, when you pursue that and look at what the goals are, you find that the goals are actually reasonable, but not the ones you thought they were. Anyway, I won't pursue that right now.
Okay, next up is Sharon, followed by Roger, and then Yusuf. Those of you who have questions, go ahead and click on the reactions button at the lower right-hand corner of your Zoom screen and raise your questions. Now's your chance to get them in. So Sharon, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. I think that as materialists, it's really important for us to look at how, more in depth, how the Chinese, as the largest, are to pursue zero tolerance, as you described, how they did it. And because it's described in the Western press, especially in the United States, as draconian, lockdown, imposing unrealistic and procedures that could never work in a country that is so individualistic as the United States, et cetera, et cetera. And I've had arguments, and so that's one point I want to make. And how did they do it? How did they build a hospital in 10 days? How did they feed 1.5 billion people when most of them were staying in their homes? Well, I, for one, as a Marxist, think that there's something to be said about communism creating a new human being. Now, do they have a long way to go? Of course. But I think that you need to look at the kind of human beings that implement such a policy. There were people recruited to go do the shopping, and there were people recruited to figure out how one person from a household was allowed to go out to get whatever, periodically, etc. And the other thing I wanted to say, I really thank you for your numbers, the numbers that you supplied. And I've had arguments with people who refuse to believe the numbers that are coming out of China. Oh, they lie all the time. But even if we double or triple the numbers that the Chinese are producing, let's say they're lying by 100%, it's still obvious that their policy is much more effective than what the United States is pursuing. Thank you.
Yeah, and the question of the numbers are wrong. I know I've encountered that frequently. You know, that's one way to dismiss the argument is just to say, I don't believe their numbers. So, well, at that point, then you can't have a conversation. Okay, fine. But I've noticed that the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal don't contest the numbers. Now, they acknowledge that China has done very well. And they also acknowledge that China pursues zero, has always said zero is our approach. So you're talking about an approach that's very different from the ones we've pursued throughout most of the Western world, the capitalist world. And I think it's acknowledged now, at least within mainstream media, if not on the street, that those numbers are valid and that they reflect the approach the Chinese have taken. But so now, instead of contesting the numbers, they ask whether this approach is reasonable, even at the same time acknowledging that Chinese accept the approach and support the approach of their government. Now, I should point out that I was attributing, Raj suggested that I was saying this was a capitalism versus socialism issue. I think the argument that I make I don't argue that China is a country without capitalism. It is a country that does have capitalism. But the question is whether a country is one in which capitalism is in charge or one in which capitalism is not in charge, but is used as a tool by, say, a communist government, as is the case in China or in Vietnam. And if capitalism is not in charge, if capitalism does not dictate the approach you're taking, and I think that in capitalist countries, there were two approaches that were dictated that were consistent with the capitalist system. And those approaches were vaccine. And in countries that didn't have the capability to develop a vaccine quickly, the other approach was a public health approach. But most of the countries in the capitalist world took a vaccine approach. In countries in which capitalism was not in charge, but in which capitalism was still present, there was now the latitude, because these countries weren't constrained by capitalist imperatives. There was a latitude to pursue public health and to pursue public health approaches. That's my argument.
Okay, next up is Roger, followed by Yusuf. Roger, if you would unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Stephen. I always say that you never disappoint us, and certainly this has been an example of that. I have two comments, more or less reinforcing things that you say, and then I have a question. So on the question of the draconian lockdowns, I think we should realize that we've had real draconian lockdowns. What we haven't had is consistently draconian lockdowns. Like one corporation will lock down all their workers, and another corporation will say, we're open for business. I live in California. We had Tesla very early on, when the entire state was locked down, they opened their assembly lines. So the difference is really is more of the ability of the state to coordinate rather than the absolute difference in methodology. The second thing I wanted to comment on, just very briefly, you mentioned that Cuba had a problem and you mentioned that they had economic necessity to abandon some of their COVID control measures. And I just wanted to add a little bit to that because I'm an activist around Latin America. That is that the economic necessity was the US blockade of Cuba, and that Cuban was under a asphyxiating blockade right now from the United States, and that the response to the COVID emergency of the United States was to tighten the blockade rather than to loosen it and to make it more difficult for Cubans to survive. And the Cubans had a question really of an issue of whether to eat or lock down. And to be quite honest, the eating part isn't all that good there yet. Right now, they are suffering from malnutrition because of the blockade. Third, this is the question, and you alluded to it earlier in the talk, and I want to hear your thoughts. Think back to February, March of 2020, when the United States first sort of said, yeah, there's a pandemic, we better do something about it. But they said, hey, we'll just get through the winter flu season. And then by spring, hey, everything's going to be hunky-dory. Then springtime came and they said, yeah, well, I think we have to go through the summer. But by when school opens in September, hey, no problem. And that's gone on now, for over 2 years. And so my question around that is, first, why were all the experts, so to speak, so consistently wrong, and why they didn't learn from their previous mistakes, but also the whole issue of handling the COVID crisis has become a hot button issue. And of all the things that the accusations have been thrown around about, the fact that we are consistently told and consistently incorrectly told how severe the issue is and what we need to do to solve it. Why hasn't that become one of those things, well, Fauci lied to us about this? Because everything else that Fauci said, the people criticize, but that's the one they don't criticize. And so corollary to that is, it seems to me, and I want to ask you if that was your view as well, that it was way back in February, March of 2020, we could have seen scientifically that this crisis was not the one that's going to be over after the flu season. Was that knowledge there present, or was that something that people had to learn scientifically? Thank you.
No, it was there. About Fauci, I do talk about Fauci a lot in my book because I found Fauci very interesting. I talk about the way in which science has been used to justify certain actions. And Fauci is a really interesting character. Fauci at one point said, I am science. So if you criticize me, you are criticizing science. Those are his actual words. And politicians have done the same thing. They talk about, I'm going to follow the science. We're only following the science because once I label this as science, you cannot criticize it because to do so would be irrational. And this often has absolutely nothing to do with the science. One thing I also explore in my book is how Biden talked about how he was going to follow the science and never followed the science. In fact, Biden followed whatever the CEOs of Moderna and Pfizer told him to do, which became a really interesting case on boosters. On boosters, Biden made the decision that the United States needed boosters, and he made that decision in the summer of 2021. After Pfizer and Moderna told them that that's what was needed. And scientists said, there's no case for boosters, which led to the head of the FDA Vaccine Advisory Board, both of them resigning in protest. That's a really interesting story about boosters. But Biden invoked science to justify this when he wasn't pursuing any science at all. And often you're using science as a way to pursue profit-making goals and as a cover for pursuing profit-making goals. And then when we talk about experts, what experts? The experts that the mainstream media put forth. Well, I shouldn't say that. There are lots of experts that are in the mainstream media that had contested the views of what I call, Washington's cognoscente, what the White House was saying, what the science advisor was saying, what Bill Gates was saying, what the pharmaceuticals companies were saying. You could look at that. That's what everyone called the experts. But then you could look at what virologists were saying and infectious disease experts were saying that were being quoted liberally in the Wall Street Journal and in the New York Times. And they were saying something different from what the Washington cognoscente were saying. It was all there in the mainstream media, but I think most people didn't notice or didn't pay attention. Actually, it's really interesting how much you can find in the mainstream media, which seems to contest what everyone thinks is the official view.
But why did they so underestimate the measures that needed to be done and so misled us to think that everything will be wonderful right around the corner?
But when you say they, who do you mean by they?
Well, I think I'm saying, and you'll have to help me, I think I'm saying the people that are presented as a scientific establishment like Fauci.
Right. Because right from the beginning, they decided that the approach was a vaccine. That was it. There would be no public health approach. The approach was a vaccine. Public health approach is going to be an expense. A vaccine is going to make money for lots of people. Well, not lots of people, for the people that Fauci knew, for the people who are in the White House. You know how many people, science advisors, what percentage of, not percentage, but how many people in the Biden cabinet have extensive investments in Pfizer, including the science advisor? Or even throughout Washington, within the financial elite. I mean, this has been a great bonanza for the US ruling class. I mean, that's the approach to making a lot of money. Public health is not an approach to making money. But they might have believed that was the approach. They might have said that was the approach. But when you look elsewhere, that wasn't the case. When you look to the World Health Organization, the World Health Organization was pretty clear that this was going to be a problem and it wasn't going to fade away. Interestingly, it was Gates who was minimizing. Gates had this really interesting thing he said early in the pandemic, which was, I'm working on this. I'm talking with AstraZeneca. I'm talking with Fauci every day because you know what? This is really the pandemic and solving the pandemic. This is all about innovation, and technology and vaccine innovation. It's not within the World Health Organization's bailiwick. Those are his words. It's not within their bailiwick. He presented himself kind of as the encephalon of the world's pandemic response because he was an expert in vaccine innovation and he was talking with all the movers and shakers like Fauci and whoever else. He's had an enormous influence on the public health response, or at least pandemic response. And he also has enormous investments in the pharmaceutical industry. He's benefited just as much as some other people. Well, he's benefited considerably. And I don't want to attribute all of the US pandemic response to Bill Gates alone, because he was only an example of one billionaire and the way in which he can use his influence and his money to influence the public agenda to his advantage and to the advantage of other billionaires. One of the things I also explore in my book is billionaires like Gates and like Elon Musk and others, and this kind of philosophy that they've been propagating, also propagated in the notion of stakeholder capitalism. The whole notion that all you need is capitalism because capitalism can look after humanity's problems. Capitalism, just set capitalism loose and give it a little money, maybe, from the government, hand the private enterprise money, and it will solve all of the problems. That's stakeholder capitalism. You don't have to rely on the government. You don't have to rely on socialism. You don't need socialism because capitalism can solve the world's problems.
Okay, next up is Youssef.
Yes, I'd like you to. Tend to agree, although I don't have all the figures, with Roger concerning Cuba. And could you elaborate on that? Also, I believe that China, yes, in the beginning made a mistake, but acknowledged it. Third, there's the case of Israel, which had a extensive, at least an extensive vaccination problem. I don't know about its public health approach, but it denied everything to the Palestinian territories. And third, also, your comment on countries like Brazil, who simply chose to ignore it for most of the time.
I gather from what I'm hearing that there are some people here who like China and some people who are not that keen on China. And we keep bringing up this issue of China making a mistake or China mishandling the emergence of this, potential pandemic pathogen. To me, that question is kind of little relevance. I haven't chosen to pursue it because it's not relevant to the question of how you handle pandemics and what predisposes governments to handle them in one way versus another. In terms of Israel, just recently there was a columnist of a major newspaper in Canada who wrote an article about Israel's approach, and he described Israel as one of the world's leader, a world leader in the response to the pandemic. That's what Israel was, to which I replied, well, in what world would that be? It can't be a world that includes China, because if you look at Israel's numbers, its mortality per million, for example, it's actually much higher than the world average and vastly higher than China. So how anyone could ever suggest that Israel was a world leader in the response to the pandemic is just mind-boggling. But why would they suggest that Israel was a world leader? Probably because what Israel is a leader in is ignoring an observation made by the World Health Organization repeatedly, which is you cannot vaccinate your way out of a pandemic. And that is precisely Israel's response. We're going to vaccinate our way out of this pandemic. So we're the first country that's going to offer a booster. They were the first countries to offer boosters. Now the boosters haven't worked, so what are they going to do? Offer another booster. Well, I mean, this should be a case study in how you cannot boost your way out of a pandemic. But it's curious then that by using vaccines over and over and over with no success, suddenly you're described as being successful. Because now we equate success with vaccination, just as has been the case in the United States all along. What's successful? We've rolled out some vaccines. So I guess the pandemic is over, must be over. We rolled out the vaccines. And so rolling out vaccines, vaccination becomes equated with success in dealing with the pandemic. That's an interesting question. Why is that? I mean, what is it that compels mass media, governments, businesses to describe success in dealing with the pandemic as vaccination, even when the numbers suggest otherwise? It's like all evidence is against vaccination, all belief is for.
Let me make
Youssef,
So small clarification. I do like China. I just want to point out that China did criticize whatever mistakes it might have made. It did engage in some in self-criticism.
Okay, let's move on. We have to wrap this up pretty soon. We've got a real flurry of hands for questions. So I'm gonna start with Leslie, Richard, and then Eric. And we're gonna have to cut it off pretty soon. But wow, what a great response in terms of questions. Go ahead, Leslie.
Well, just first of all, just very briefly, living in North Texas, the whole question of people being willing to accept some rather restrictive policies. Frankly, I mean, those of us with differing views sort of laugh about that up here. I mean, people come out with guns. It has nothing to do with civil liberties. They don't give a crap about civil liberties. The First Amendment doesn't exist in their minds, to be honest, only the Second Amendment. And they are just screaming about any kind of restrictions from the start. The small examples that were put in place were quickly withdrawn in Texas because of that reaction. But also involving Texas, you mentioned Dr. Hotez, who's been I think he's been pretty terrific, but I'm sure you're aware that recently he and his coworkers developed an inexpensive vaccine. They couldn't get any money from the government. They got $1 million from Tito's handmade vodka and some more from some philanthropic sources. He said it's not, what we did was not innovative at all. It's been the basis for a lot of earlier vaccines, and we started developing this almost 20 years ago. And they've developed an inexpensive vaccine. They're not patenting it, and it's been tested in other countries, and it's starting to be mass produced in India, and they said it will be in Botswana and Indonesia and whatever. And he made an interesting comment at one point regarding colonialism, and he said that one of his and his colleagues' intentions was to combat neocolonialism. I just wondered what you think of that.
I kind of lost. Who was going to combat neocolonialism?
Dr. Peter Hotez. He said because he did not, he was not happy with these innovative vaccines that were being hoarded by the rich capitalist countries. And he said that Biden saying we're going to give what it was, 200 and something million vaccines to the rest of the world, he said was a minuscule fraction of what was needed. And that the vaccine that he and his colleagues developed and were not patenting, is going to be produced in bulk all over the world.
Yes, and that's interesting. And not only him, there are others as well, who are humanitarian scientists who've developed vaccines and want to make them available free without license, so the world can benefit. And it's not interesting, but it's predictable the way in which capitalism treats those people.
Right.
I mean, AstraZeneca is a great example of that. Those who developed the AstraZeneca vaccine wanted to make it available for free. And who stepped in immediately to shut that down was Bill Gates. And why? Because Bill Gates had made enormous contributions to the University of Oxford vaccine program, and he exercises his influence that way. There's another example of some scientists in Finland, I think it was, who've also come up with what they thought could be an effective vaccine, which was delivered nasally, had all kinds of advantages. They went out searching for someone to back their trials. They could get no one to back the trials, and the reason they couldn't was because they wanted to give this away free and make it available to the world as a human or a public good. No one will back them. But of course, they're a little naive, assuming that anyone was going to give them money and, without expecting some kind of return. But yeah, I agree with them. It's neo-colonial as well, because you have all of these countries that now depend upon the United States and Britain. And you could argue even Russia and other countries to provide them with vaccines. One country that's providing vaccines around the world, or to some countries in the world, is Cuba, which is the only low-income country in the world that does that, or that has even developed a vaccine.
Okay, next up is Richard F., followed by Eric. So Richard, if you'd ask your question, please.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Just one parenthesis. Russia is providing the technology transfers to less developed countries for its vaccine, and apparently it's more effective than the mRNA vaccines. But a question was about the long-term effects of these mRNA vaccines. Is there any data yet on the long-term effects, or is it benign? And along those lines, I'm concerned about this push for vaccinations for 5-year-old, or very young children. They have a low incidence of COVID, but there's some controversy about whether they may have long-term consequences for the vaccine. So the vaccine may be more damaging than the COVID for young children. I wonder if you have any more information on those questions. Thank you.
Unfortunately, this is ambiguous, and there's not a lot of information, and there probably never will be. We don't know if there are long-term effects from mRNA vaccines or any of the vaccines. One of the problems is in the rush to get vaccines into people's arms, because we had a medical emergency that didn't need, was that the trials that were set up to test not only the efficacy of these vaccines, but the safety, were cut short. They were cut short after 2 months. Now, interestingly, and so that means we know something about the safety up to 2 months, but we don't know about the safety of the vaccines beyond 2 months. We don't know about their midterm safety. We don't know about their long-term safety. And one thing that I suggested was perhaps these vaccines would never have been approved if the trials had been taken out 2 years. One of the problems is that in the trials we have control groups, the placebo group that just receives the placebo, and the experimental group that receives the vaccine. Well, once the vaccines, after 2 months, were authorized for emergency use, people in the placebo group said, well, I want a vaccine too. I don't want to be in this placebo group and be unvaccinated for 2 years. And they especially said that because where did they run the trials? They ran the trials in countries where there was a large outbreak. You couldn't run these trials in China, because if you ran them in China, you'd have to run the trials for years, decades, before you'd ever got enough people who were infected by the disease before you could start comparing the control and placebo groups. So they allowed people in the placebo groups to leave. Once they have allowed that, effectively, you no longer have a trial and no way in which to adequately assess safety and efficacy. So this is ambiguous. But the point about 5-year-olds, I mean, there is a danger with any vaccine, just as there's a danger with any drug. So the question is the danger of the disease greater than the danger of the vaccine? So for some groups, yes, the danger of the disease is far greater than any danger you'll face from the vaccines. That's true for elderly people or those who are immunocompromised. But for those who are 5 or under, well, the danger from the vaccine may in fact be greater, and that probably is, than the danger of contracting the disease. So there's been this debate about even whether you should, well, certainly whether there was a story in the New York Times today about boosting, about boosters. Should there be universal boosting? And the data seems to suggest that no, there should not be universal boosting, because the benefits to, say, people under 65 are less than the dangers of taking the vaccine. So there's a question. And anti-vaxxers have exploited this too, because some people will have an adverse reaction to the vaccine. They've counted up all those people, and then they cite what seems like alarming numbers, like X, 10,000 people have had this problem, or X thousand people have died from the vaccine. And one thing that we ought not to lose sight of is that vaccines are not without a potential for harm.
Okay, just a few more questions. Next up is Eric, followed by Gulden, and then Kim, and then I think we'll cut it off after that. We're moving on here. So Eric, if you would unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, so I have about 3 questions. The first one has to do with the mortality statistics that you cited. And I wanted to ask you, are you aware of the difficulty in comparing mortality statistics from country to country, whereas some mortality statistics count anyone who has died with COVID as a COVID death and others do not? That's the first question. Second one is, are you familiar with the Great Barrington Declaration? Have you researched that and the reaction of US medical authorities like Fauci to that declaration? Third, do you follow the Jimmy Dore show? He actually had a in-depth interview with 2 of the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration. He's done a lot of good coverage of COVID, so I would recommend people check him out. And finally, are you in favor of vaccination mandates?
Let's start with the last one. Am I in favor of vaccine mandates? I'm in favor of mandates. Well, this would be contingent. No, maybe I shouldn't. I mean, I could go on for a long time about that, and it would become this elaborate discussion. I wouldn't say absolutely yes that I'm in favor of them, and I wouldn't say absolutely no. I would certainly be in favor of safe and effective vaccines, or vaccines that have been demonstrated to be safe and effective, in conditions in which universal vaccination is the only way to resolve a problem. Am I in favor, would I have been in favor of mandatory vaccination where the vaccine has been approved for emergency use? No, I don't think so. Because in those cases, the safety protocol is not determined, and I don't think that you can compel someone to take a drug whose safety is still in question. But anyway, I don't have a black and white view about, yes, vaccine mandates are good, or yes, they're bad. Do I watch the Jimmy Dore show? No. The mortality figures, yes, I am aware of that. And that's always a difficulty, not only mortality, but the morbidity figures as well. Different countries define morbidity differently. But I think you're talking about the debate between, did you die with COVID versus did you die because of COVID? I'm not sure that you can disentangle those things. If someone is admitted to the hospital and they're suffering from heart disease, and when they arrive at the hospital, it's discovered that they also have COVID, I think it's kind of silly to say that you can say, well, this person died of heart disease and not COVID, or this person died of COVID and not heart disease. It could be both. How do you disentangle them? And in terms of the Great Barrington Declaration, it's been a long time since I've read that, so I might be thinking of it in the wrong way. And if I am, tell me. But I think the argument essentially was that restrictions should be limited to those who are most vulnerable. And otherwise, if you're not vulnerable, and the argument was most people weren't, and this is true, most people who are infected with COVID will recover. Most people will experience mild to moderate symptoms. I don't deny that. Most people, the vast majority, will recover. But that's never been the issue. The issue is enough people will become sick, enough people will be hospitalized that it put enormous strain on medical resources and cause economic upheaval. But as far as I understood, the Great Barrington Declaration was, well, we could avoid all of this upheaval. We can avoid pressure on medical resources if we simply limit our restrictions, our public health measures to elderly people and those with comorbidities. And one of the arguments against that was, well, when you count up all the people, especially in the United States, with comorbidities and the elderly people, and then take into account that elderly people and people with comorbidities interact with people who are not elderly and do not have comorbidities, that this becomes a completely unworkable solution.
Okay, next up is Kim. If you could ask your question, try to keep it short. We're getting towards the end here, followed by Golden, then I think we're going to cut it off. So go ahead, Kim. Okay, why don't we go to Golden first, and then we'll see if Kim can unmute herself. Golden, if you'd go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, mine is more like a comment. We are comparing ourselves to a rich big country, China, but even a small colonial country, Turkey, managed the COVID much better than the United States. You know, when we were in Turkey, for example, we needed to take a PCR test to take a plane from Istanbul to here. And they sent a nurse to our hotel room in order to get the PCR test. As opposed to my daughter and my son-in-law came from Chicago during Christmas time. And my daughter felt a sore throat and wanted to get a COVID test. And none of the pharmacies had in-home test. They were out. And also none of the test sites were open at that time. So we had to pay $150 each to get a COVID test in 2 hours. So that was so inconvenient at that time. And also what Turkey did at the beginning, as you said, most vulnerable, 65 and older people, they applied curfew on them, even though it was stupid at some point because these people couldn't even go to the bank to get $200. They had to call the cops and give their password to them and then get $200 from their ATM. So the other thing they did, which was kind of stupid, is everybody had to wear in a car, everybody had to wear masks, even if you are alone. So that was some kind of mandatory thing. And but one positive thing was they developed this something called HES code, which is the software on your cell phone. And if you don't have a HES, this is pretty much tracking who has COVID. If you don't have a HES code, you can't go into the ATMs, you can't go to the grocery stores, you can't go anywhere. And by looking at the application code in your cell phone, you immediately know who has COVID around you. So they adopted some kind of software like this. And, those are some positive things they did that I believe they were able to keep the numbers down. Thank you.
Okay. Let's see, Kim, did you have a question? Otherwise, we'll wrap this up. Kim, are you able to unmute? Okay, why don't we go ahead, Stephen, if you have any closing remarks, go ahead and say a few words.
No, I don't think I have any closing remarks. I mean, we've covered a lot of things. There's many things that that can't be covered that are covered in my book when it comes out. There are many fascinating stories and issues about this that are addressed in that book. And I guess I think we've covered a lot of ground here, so nothing more to say.
Okay, great. First of all, I just wanted to thank you once again for coming out. I've been really following this issue closely, and I believe that your blog and this presentation are the two most informative sources of information and clear thinking about what's going on in the pandemic. I would encourage people to check out his blog, What's Left, Gowans.blog, and then go to Baraka Books to purchase the book to follow up on this. Really want to thank you for coming out. This was a great presentation. I want to thank everybody for your questions and comments. It was a very rich discussion. I think that there's a lot more that we can talk about related to this issue, but this is a great start and good food for thought and for political analysis and action. So thank you very much, Stephen. Really appreciate your coming by. Thanks.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Stephen. This was absolutely great. Wonderful. Really appreciate it. And we're going to Shanghai you and force you to come back. So be prepared.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses. Since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, @yahoo.com, and the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.